Top 10 creepiest winter ghost stories to give you chills. Winter nights are long, dark, and cold, a perfect setting for ghostly tales that have been whispered around fireplaces for centuries. What makes these tales even more haunting is that they are based on true accounts from people who swear by their chilling encounters. Story number 1. My name is Sarah Holden, and last winter I rented Blackwood Lodge in Colorado, hoping for a quiet weekend retreat. The lodge was beautiful, isolated, surrounded by snow-laden pines, and overlooking a frozen lake that glittered in the moonlight. It felt like stepping into a winter postcard. I thought I was alone out there, but I was wrong. The first night was uneventful. I sipped tea by the fireplace, enjoying the quiet and warmth. But on the second night, everything changed. Around midnight, I woke to a sound. Soft, deliberate footsteps crunching through the snow. At first, I thought it was a stray animal, but the sound didn't waver. It grew closer, steady and human-like. Nervous but curious, I got out of bed and went to the window. Pulling the curtain aside, I looked out over the snow-covered yard. At first, I saw nothing, just the pristine, undisturbed snow under the pale light of the moon. But then I saw her. She stood near the edge of the frozen lake, dressed in what looked like a wedding gown. The dress was torn and weathered, her veil fluttering in the cold wind. My breath caught in my throat. She was completely still, her head tilted slightly downward, as though deep in thought. I wanted to convince myself she was some kind of prank, or maybe a trick of the light. But then she moved. Slowly, she raised her head and looked straight at me. Her face was like something out of a nightmare. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, with patches of frost clinging to her cheeks. Her eyes were hollow, dark voids, and her lips were blue and cracked. I stood frozen, locked in her empty gaze. Then she opened her mouth, as if trying to speak, but no sound came. That's when I stumbled backward, my heart pounding, the curtain falling back into place. I wanted to believe it was a bad dream, but then I heard it, a faint sobbing, soft and mournful, carrying through the still night. It wasn't coming from the lodge, it was outside, near the lake. I forced myself to stay in bed, too terrified to look out the window again. The crying continued for what felt like hours before fading away. When daylight finally came, I worked up the courage to go outside. The snow around the lodge was untouched, except for a single set of footprints leading from the frozen lake to the window of my bedroom, then stopping abruptly. My stomach churned as I stared at those tracks, trying to make sense of it. Later that day, I spoke to Richard Bennett, a local historian I'd met briefly when booking the lodge. When I described what I had seen, his face turned pale. "You saw Emily Harper," he said. "She's been haunting that lodge for over a century." He went on to tell me the story. In 1912, Emily Harper had been set to marry Arthur Langston, a wealthy businessman. They had planned a small ceremony at the lodge, but on the morning of their wedding, Arthur disappeared without explanation. Devastated, Emily refused to believe he'd left her. She spent the entire night searching for him, wandering the snow-covered property in her wedding gown. A brutal snowstorm rolled in, and Emily was found days later, frozen to death by the lake, her bouquet still clutched in her hands. No one ever discovered what happened to Arthur. Since then, countless visitors have reported strange occurrences at the lodge, phantom sobbing, frost forming on the inside of windows, and a woman in white wandering the grounds. Some say she's still searching for Arthur, trapped in an endless loop of heartbreak. I left the lodge that morning, unable to shake the chill of what I had experienced. Emily's empty eyes and the frost-covered window where her face had been are images I'll never forget. I used to think winter's chill was just a natural phenomenon, but now I know better. There are things colder than snow out there, waiting in the shadows. Story number 2. My name is Michael Grant, And this story happened during the harsh winter of 2021, when I decided to spend a week in Silent Hollow, a small, snowbound town in Montana. I'd rented a rustic cabin at the edge of the woods, eager to enjoy some solitude and photograph the breathtaking snowy landscapes. What I encountered instead was something I'll never forget. The first few nights were peaceful, albeit eerily quiet. The snow fell constantly, muffling every sound, making the cabin feel like it was floating in a void. On the third night, a blizzard rolled in, rattling the windows and burying the surroundings in a thick white blanket. I stayed inside, trying to ignore the wind howling like a wild animal. Around 2 a.m., I heard it, a soft knock at the door. At first, I thought it was a branch being blown against the cabin, but the sound came again, deliberate and rhythmic. 3 sharp knocks. My heart started to race. Who would be out here in the middle of a snowstorm? I hesitated, then opened the door a crack. No one was there. The snow outside was untouched, glittering under the faint glow of the porch light. I called out, "Hello?" But my voice was swallowed by the storm. I closed the door, locking it this time, and tried to calm my nerves. That's when I noticed the frost-covered window beside the door. There, pressed against the glass, was a tiny handprint. I froze, staring at it. It was too small to belong to an adult, and too detailed to be an accident. Before I could react, the knocking started again, this time softer, more frantic. It sounded like 2 sets of knocks now, as if more than one person was trying to get in. Then, a faint voice whispered through the storm, "Please, help us." It was the voice of a child. My stomach turned to ice. I wanted to open the door, but something deep inside me screamed not to. Instead, I backed away slowly, clutching my phone, though I knew there was no signal in this remote area. The whispers continued, growing louder, accompanied by faint cries. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the knocking stopped, and the cabin was silent again. The next morning, I ventured outside to see if I could make sense of what happened. The storm had calmed, and the sun reflected blindingly off the snow. To my shock, I found a set of tiny footprints leading to the cabin. They stopped just outside the door, but didn't lead away. I followed them as far as I could, but they disappeared at the edge of the forest. When I got back to town, I asked around about strange occurrences in the area. An older resident, Margaret Duval, listened intently as I described the knocks, the handprints, and the voices. She sighed heavily and told me the story of the frostbitten children. In the winter of 1888, a group of orphans from a nearby town had tried to escape their abusive caretaker. The blizzard that year was one of the worst in recorded history. The children, poorly dressed and without shelter, were found days later, frozen to death in the woods near Silent Hollow. Since then, people who stay near the forest during heavy snowstorms report hearing knocking and cries for help. Some have even seen ghostly figures of children wandering the woods, their frostbitten faces pale and desperate. I couldn't shake the story, or the memory of those tiny handprints pressed against the window. I left Silent Hollow the next day, but the experience has haunted me ever since. I've heard people say winter is beautiful, but now, when I see snow, I think of those children and their desperate cries, and I always wonder, what would have happened if I'd opened the door? Story number 3. My name is Daniel Cross, and I've been an avid hiker and outdoorsman for years. In December 2019, I decided to explore the remote forests of northern Canada, near an abandoned railway line that hadn't been in use for decades. The area was beautiful, blanketed in fresh snow, but it was also desolate. I'd been warned by locals about sudden snowstorms, but I didn't expect the weather to turn as quickly as it did. On my 3rd day of hiking, a heavy snowstorm rolled in, forcing me to make camp near the old railway tracks. As the wind howled and snow piled around my tent, I heard something that made my heart stop. the distant sound of a train whistle. It made no sense. The tracks had been abandoned for over 70 years, yet the sound was unmistakable. I unzipped my tent and stepped out into the freezing wind, scanning the snowy horizon. That's when I saw it. Emerging from the swirling snow was a train, a glowing locomotive with a dim, bluish light illuminating its windows. It moved slowly, almost gracefully, along the rusted tracks. As it approached, I saw the figures inside, pale, shadowy passengers, their faces expressionless. Some pressed their hands against the glass, their eyes wide with what looked like terror. The train slowed as it passed me, and for a brief moment, I locked eyes with the conductor. His face was gaunt, almost skeletal, with hollow eyes that seemed to see straight through me. He tipped his hat before the train disappeared into the blizzard, leaving no trace behind, no tracks in the snow, no sound, nothing. I stood there, frozen in place, unsure if I had hallucinated the whole thing. When I returned to the nearest town, I told my story to a local bartender named Jack Coleman. He listened intently, then leaned in close. "You saw the Arctic Express," he said, his voice low. "You're not the first." Jack explained that in 1925, a train carrying miners and their families derailed on those tracks during a fierce blizzard. The train plunged into a ravine, killing everyone on board. According to legend, the Arctic Express still appears on the coldest, stormiest nights, replaying its doomed journey. Some believe the spirits of the passengers are trapped, unable to move on, forever riding the ghostly train. After hearing Jack's story, I felt a deep chill, not from the winter air, but from the thought of what I'd seen. I couldn't shake the image of the conductor's hollow eyes or the silent passengers staring out into the void. To this day, I avoid hiking near abandoned railways, especially in the winter. I can still hear the faint whistle of the Arctic Express in my nightmares, a haunting reminder that some journeys never end. Story number 4. My name is Rachel Carter, and in February 2020, I joined a group of friends for a winter hiking trip in the Rocky Mountains. There were 5 of us, me, my boyfriend Josh, and our friends Emily, Ryan, and Tom. We were all experienced hikers, but none of us were prepared for what we were about to face, or for what we would encounter in that snowstorm. The weather forecast had warned of light snow, but by the second day of our trip, a sudden blizzard rolled in, trapping us on the mountain trail. The snow was relentless, whipping against our faces and cutting visibility down to almost nothing. We tried to stay calm, but the cold was seeping into our bones, and we were all starting to panic. The trail markers had disappeared, buried beneath the snow, and we had no idea where we were. After what felt like hours of trudging blindly through the blizzard, we saw it, a dark figure in the distance. At first, it looked like a person, standing completely still, partially obscured by the swirling snow. Josh called out, "Hey, over here!" But the figure didn't respond. It just stood there, waiting. We debated whether to follow it, but as the snowstorm grew worse, we didn't have much of a choice. Slowly, the figure began to move, walking ahead of us at a steady pace. It never got too far, always staying just within our line of sight. It was strange, but we were desperate, so we followed. The figure led us down a narrow path we hadn't noticed before. The wind howled around us, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Every time I tried to focus on the figure, it seemed less human, its shape blurred and shadowy, almost like it was flickering in and out of existence. Josh reassured me that it was just the storm playing tricks on my eyes, but I wasn't so sure. Eventually, the figure stopped in front of what looked like an abandoned cabin. It was half buried in snow, with broken shutters and a door hanging crookedly on its hinges. The figure turned toward us, but before we could get a clear look, it vanished, just dissolved into the snowstorm, leaving no footprints behind. We didn't have time to question it. The cabin was our only hope for shelter. We pushed the door open and stumbled inside, grateful for the reprieve from the biting wind. The interior was old and sparse, with a broken fireplace and rickety furniture. We lit a small fire and huddled together, trying to process what had just happened. When the storm finally cleared the next morning, we found our way back to the main trail and returned to town. As we recounted the story to locals, their faces grew pale. One of them, a man named Henry Lawson, told us about Tom Davis, a park ranger who had died on that mountain in 1984. He'd been caught in a blizzard while trying to guide a group of hikers to safety. They survived, but Tom's body was found days later, frozen in the snow. Locals believe his spirit still roams the mountains during storms, helping lost hikers find their way. The description matched what we'd seen, a shadowy figure, always leading, but never lingering. To this day, I can't explain what we experienced. Was it the spirit of Tom Davis, or was it something else entirely? All I know is that without that figure, we wouldn't have made it out alive. Some people say ghosts are trapped souls, but if that's true, maybe some are trapped because they have unfinished business, because they still want to help. Story number 5. My name is Jessica Warren, and this happened in January 2022 when I visited Wintervale Cemetery in Vermont. I had recently lost my grandmother, who was buried there, and I thought a quiet visit might bring me some peace. Instead, I encountered something that still haunts me to this day. It was a cold, overcast afternoon when I arrived. The cemetery was nearly empty, covered in a thick layer of snow, with rows of gravestones poking out like teeth. I brought a bouquet of roses and placed them on my grandmother's grave. The silence was overwhelming, broken only by the crunch of my boots in the snow. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the headstones, I decided it was time to leave. That's when I heard it, a soft, mournful cry. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the sound grew clearer. It was unmistakably human, filled with sorrow. I froze, my heart pounding, and scanned the cemetery for any sign of someone else. Then I saw her. She was standing a few rows away, partially hidden behind an old oak tree. She wore a long black dress that looked tattered and out of place, as if it belonged to another era. In her hands, she held a bouquet of flowers, white lilies, their petals wilted and frosted. Her head was bowed, her shoulders shaking as though she were sobbing. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. She didn't respond. Slowly, I started walking toward her, each step hesitant. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" As I got closer, she lifted her head, and I felt the blood drain from my face. Her eyes were hollow, dark voids, and her cheeks were streaked with what looked like frozen tears. Her lips moved silently, forming words I couldn't hear. Then she dropped the bouquet, and as it hit the snow, she vanished, just disappeared into thin air. The lilies lay in the snow, untouched and real, as though she had actually been there. Terrified, I ran back to my car and didn't stop until I was safely inside with the doors locked. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely turn the key in the ignition. I sped home, trying to convince myself it was some kind of hallucination brought on by the cold and grief. A week later, I couldn't resist the urge to learn more. I went to the local library and dug through historical records about the cemetery. That's when I found her story. Her name was Clara Wells, a young woman from the late 1800s. Clara had lost her son during a brutal snowstorm. His grave was never marked, and she spent years searching the cemetery, looking for him. One night, she went out during another storm, determined to find his resting place. She never returned. Her body was found days later, frozen near the cemetery's oak tree, clutching a bouquet of lilies. Locals believe her spirit still wanders the graveyard on cold winter nights, crying for her lost child. Since then, I haven't been back to Wintervale Cemetery, but I can't get Clara's face out of my mind. That hollow stare, those frozen tears, they're etched into my memory. People say cemeteries are peaceful, a place for the dead to rest, but sometimes the dead aren't ready to let go, and sometimes they want you to know their pain. Story number 6. My name is Mark Ellis, and in February 2021, I stayed at the famous Ice Hotel in Jukkasjärvi, Sweden. It was something I had always wanted to experience, a hotel made entirely of ice and snow, with intricately carved rooms that looked like something out of a fairy tale. But what started as a dream vacation quickly turned into a nightmare I'll never forget. When I arrived, the staff was friendly, and the place was as beautiful as I'd imagined. Each room had unique ice sculptures, and the soft glow of LED lights made the ice walls shimmer. The bed was a platform of ice covered with thick furs and thermal sleeping bags. I was told to keep my room's temperature constant, even though it was already freezing. It was all part of the charm, or so I thought. The first night passed uneventfully, but on the second night, strange things began to happen. I woke up around 2 a.m. to a faint whisper, so soft it was almost inaudible. I couldn't make out the words, but it sounded like a man's voice, speaking in Swedish. Assuming it was just the sound of the wind outside, I closed my eyes and tried to sleep, but the whispering continued, growing slightly louder. I sat up and scanned the room. The glow from the ice walls made it easy to see everything, but nothing was out of place. Then I noticed the sculpture in the corner. It was a figure carved from ice, meant to look like a man kneeling. The strange part was that earlier in the day, the figure had been facing the opposite direction. Now, it was turned slightly toward the bed. A chill ran down my spine, and not just from the cold. Telling myself it was my imagination, I buried myself in the sleeping bag and forced myself to sleep. But the next morning, when I woke up, the figure was facing me directly. Its icy face seemed to have changed. It looked less serene, more twisted, as though it were grimacing. I reported it to the staff, but they brushed it off, saying the ice sometimes shifts as it melts and refreezes. That explanation didn't sit well with me, but I tried to ignore it. That night, however, things escalated. As I lay in bed, I felt a sudden drop in temperature, even colder than the usual freezing air. My breath fogged up in front of me, forming thick clouds that didn't dissipate. Then, I heard the whispering again, but this time, it wasn't just one voice. It sounded like several people, all speaking in low, urgent tones, too fast for me to understand. I sat up, and that's when I saw him. A faint figure stood near the edge of the bed, barely visible against the icy backdrop. He was translucent, his features blurred, but his eyes were piercing and full of anguish. He pointed toward the ice sculpture in the corner, and as I turned to look, the whispering grew deafening. The sculpture began to crack, thin lines spiderwebbing across its surface. Then, with a loud snap, a chunk of ice fell to the floor, revealing something frozen inside, a man's wedding ring. I bolted out of the room and spent the rest of the night in the lobby, unable to go back. The next day, I demanded answers from the staff. One of them, an older woman named Ingrid, reluctantly told me the truth. Years ago, a man named Lars Nyström had stayed at the hotel on his honeymoon. After an argument with his wife, he went out into the freezing night and was later found dead in the snow, not far from where the hotel stood. His wife claimed she heard him whispering to her in the room before she realized he was gone. The ring, Ingrid said, must have been his. I left the ice hotel that day, cutting my trip short. The memory of that ghostly figure, the whispering voices, and the cracking ice still haunts me. Some say the cold preserves memories, but in that place, it felt like the cold preserved something far more sinister. Story number 7. My name is James Miller, and I'll never forget what happened during a solo hunting trip I took in Alaska in December 2020. I'd heard about an old, abandoned hunter's cabin deep in the woods, a place shrouded in local legends. I was intrigued, both by the challenge of reaching such a remote spot and by the stories of the cabin's eerie past. What I didn't realize was that the stories weren't just legends, they were warnings. It took me a full day of trekking through the snow to find the cabin. It was exactly how I imagined it. Small, weathered, and half buried in snow, with frost coating the windows like lace. The door creaked loudly as I pushed it open, and the inside smelled of damp wood and decay. A rusty stove sat in the corner, and a single cot lay against the wall, its mattress sagging and torn. Despite its condition, it was shelter, and I was grateful for it as the temperature plummeted. That night, as the wind howled outside, I built a small fire in the stove and settled in. Around midnight, I started hearing strange noises. At first, it sounded like the creaking of the cabin settling in the cold, but then it became more distinct. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. I grabbed my flashlight and opened the door, but there was no one there. Just the endless snow, untouched except for my own tracks from earlier. I convinced myself it was the wind playing tricks on my ears and tried to go back to sleep. That's when the whispers started. They were faint, just on the edge of hearing, coming from somewhere inside the cabin. My heart pounded as I scanned the room with my flashlight, but nothing seemed out of place. I was alone, or so I thought. Then I saw them. Two glowing eyes staring at me from the frost-covered window. They were piercing, almost animal-like, and fixed directly on me. I froze, unable to move or even breathe. The eyes blinked once, then disappeared. Desperate for answers, I searched the cabin for anything that could explain what I was experiencing. In one of the drawers, I found an old journal, its pages yellowed and brittle. The name on the inside cover read, Martin Hayes, and as I flipped through, I realized it belonged to the man who had lived there decades ago. The last few entries were frantic, detailing how he'd gotten lost in a snowstorm and had to return to the cabin without supplies. His final entry read, I can hear it outside. It's waiting for me. I don't think I'll make it through the night. Shivers ran down my spine as I realized that Martin Hayes had vanished during a storm in 1943 and was never found. Locals believed he had succumbed to the cold, but others whispered that something in the woods had taken him. That night, I barely slept. The whispers continued, growing louder until they were right in my ear. Then came the knocking, slow, deliberate taps on the window, as if something wanted to come inside. I didn't dare move. I stayed huddled by the fire, gripping my flashlight, until the first light of dawn broke through the cracks in the cabin walls. When I stepped outside, I saw fresh tracks in the snow. They weren't mine, and they weren't animal tracks either. They circled the cabin, just like I'd heard the night before disappearing into the woods. I left that cabin as quickly as I could and never looked back. To this day, I can't explain what I experienced, but I know I wasn't alone out there. Whether it was the ghost of Martin Hayes or something far older, I'll never know. What I do know is that the wilderness hides things that don't want to be disturbed, and if you're lucky, they'll let you leave. Story number 8. My name is Olivia Kane, and in February 2022, I went ice skating with a group of friends on Lake Minnewanka in Alberta, Canada. The lake was a stunning sheet of ice, stretching out for miles, surrounded by snow-covered mountains. It was a perfect winter day, or so it seemed. The first few hours were full of laughter and light-hearted fun. The ice was thick, and the air was crisp and clear. As the sun began to set, casting an orange glow across the frozen surface, we decided to skate toward a quieter part of the lake, far from the tourists. The area was serene, almost eerily so, with no one else around. I was the first to notice it. Beneath the ice, there was a shadow, dark, blurred, and vaguely human-shaped. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, or a crack in the ice. But as I skated closer, the shape became clearer. It was a face, a pale, ghostly face, staring up at me through the ice, its eyes wide with terror. "Do you see that?" I called out to my friends. Josh, one of the more adventurous in our group, skated over and crouched down to get a better look. "It's just a reflection," he said, but his voice wavered. Then the face moved. We all saw it this time. The face pressed against the underside of the ice as if it were trying to break through. Its mouth opened in a silent scream, and frost began to spread from where it touched, forming jagged patterns that seemed to stretch toward us. Josh stumbled back, nearly losing his balance, and we all scrambled to get away from the spot. Panic set in as we skated back toward the shoreline, but the ice beneath us cracked with an eerie groan. "Don't stop," I yelled, my heart pounding in my chest. Behind us, the frost patterns continued to spread, as though the figure was chasing us from below. When we finally reached the shore, we looked back at the spot where we'd seen the face. The ice was smooth and unbroken, as if nothing had happened. No frost patterns, no cracks, nothing. It was as if the lake itself had erased any trace of what we had seen. Shaken, we decided to head into town to warm up and try to make sense of it. At a nearby cafe, we shared what we had seen with the owner, an older woman named Eleanor Gray. Her face went pale as we described the apparition. "You saw Abigail," she said quietly. Eleanor explained that Abigail Foster was a young woman who had drowned in the lake in the early 1900s. She had been ice skating with friends when she fell through a weak spot in the ice. Her body was never recovered, and locals say her spirit haunts the lake, appearing beneath the ice on cold winter nights. Some believe she tries to lure others to the same fate. Hearing the story made my blood run cold. I couldn't stop thinking about the way her face had moved, the frost spreading like reaching fingers. To this day, I avoid frozen lakes. When I close my eyes, I still see her, trapped beneath the ice, forever staring up, waiting for someone to notice her. Story number 9. My name is Laura Jensen, and in December 2021, my family and I spent Christmas Eve in an old farmhouse in rural upstate New York. It was a picturesque place, a sprawling property surrounded by snowy fields, with a fireplace in every room and an old-world charm that felt perfect for the holidays. But what we thought would be a cozy Christmas quickly turned into a night we'd never forget. It started innocently enough. My parents, my younger brother Sam and I were decorating the tree in the living room while the snow fell softly outside. The farmhouse creaked occasionally, but that felt normal for a place so old. Around 9 p.m., as we were hanging the last few ornaments, we heard something strange, a faint knock coming from the front door. My dad, Paul, went to check, but when he opened the door, no one was there. Just the snowy porch and the icy wind howling through the night. He shrugged it off, saying it was probably a tree branch brushing against the door, and we went back to decorating. But the knocking came again, this time louder and more insistent. When we checked again, the porch was empty. That's when things started to escalate. The Christmas tree lights flickered, even though the rest of the house was perfectly lit. Then one of the ornaments, a small porcelain angel, fell off the tree and shattered on the hardwood floor. My mum, Karen, picked it up, muttering about the old floors being uneven, but I could see the unease in her face. As the night went on, the house grew colder, even with the fireplace roaring. Frost began to form on the inside of the windows, spelling something that made my stomach drop. The name, William. None of us knew a William, and the sight of it sent chills down my spine. Around midnight, the real chaos began. We were sitting around the dining table when the laughter started. It was faint at first, like a child's giggle coming from the hallway. Sam thought it was a prank, but when he went to investigate, he came back pale as a ghost. "There's no one there," he whispered, but I swear I heard it. Then the dining room chandelier began to sway, the crystal ornaments clinking against each other. The candles flickered, and the frost on the windows grew thicker. Objects on the mantel began to slide and fall to the floor. An old clock, a framed photo, a small candlestick. My dad shouted, "Enough!" But the activity didn't stop. It only grew louder. Terrified, we all huddled in the living room, unwilling to leave the house in the middle of the snowstorm. The sounds of footsteps echoed upstairs, and that eerie laughter continued to drift through the halls. None of us slept that night, and as soon as the sun rose, we packed our things and left the farmhouse behind. Later, I did some research about the property and found a chilling story. In the 1920s, the house had belonged to a man named William Grayson, who had lived there alone after his wife and child passed away. On Christmas Eve, during a particularly harsh snowstorm, William went outside to gather firewood, but locked himself out of the house. Unable to get back in, he froze to death on the porch. Ever since, residents of the farmhouse have reported strange occurrences on Christmas Eve, knocking on doors, laughter in empty rooms, and objects moving on their own. I still get goosebumps thinking about that night. Christmas is supposed to be a time of joy and warmth, but in that farmhouse, it felt like something cold and restless had claimed the holiday for itself. My family and I now stick to celebrating Christmas at home, far away from anything with a history like that. Story number 10. My name is David Reynolds, and in January 2022, I visited an abandoned manor in Vermont while on a winter road trip. I'd heard about the place from a friend who loved urban exploration. The locals called it Winter Manor because of its tragic history. It had been left to decay after its owner, Edward Tully, froze to death during a blizzard in 1897. I was drawn to the mystery and decided to check it out. The manor stood at the end of a snow-covered road, its once grand facade now weathered and crumbling. Icicles hung from the roof like jagged teeth, and frost coated the broken windows. Despite its derelict state, there was something oddly majestic about the building. The air was still, and the only sound was the crunch of my boots in the snow. As I stepped inside, the temperature seemed to drop even further. The grand entryway was covered in dust and cobwebs, and the air smelled damp and musty. A massive staircase dominated the room, its banister splintered and broken in places. Faint shafts of light filtered through the cracks in the boarded-up windows, casting eerie shadows on the walls. I started exploring, carefully making my way through the maze of decaying rooms. The further I went, the more I felt like I wasn't alone. There was a strange, oppressive silence, broken only by the occasional groan of the old floorboards. Then I heard it, a faint knocking sound coming from the front door. My heart raced as I hurried back to the entryway. The knocking continued, 3 sharp, deliberate taps, though when I opened the door, there was no one there. The snow outside was untouched, with no tracks leading to the house. I tried to tell myself it was just the wind, but deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. As I returned to the main hall, I felt an overwhelming chill. I turned toward the staircase and froze. At the top of the stairs stood a man, his figure faint and translucent, his face pale and contorted with desperation. He was pounding on an invisible door, his movements frantic, as if he were trying to escape. "Hello," I called out, my voice shaking. The figure stopped abruptly and turned toward me. His eyes were hollow, his lips blue and trembling. For a moment, we just stared at each other. Then, without a sound, he vanished, leaving behind a bone-chilling silence. Terrified, I ran out of the manor, barely stopping to grab my bag. Later, I told a local historian named Margaret Hensley what I had seen. Her expression darkened as she told me Edward Tully's story. In 1897, during a brutal snowstorm, Edward had accidentally locked himself out of the manor while trying to bring in firewood. Unable to break back in, he froze to death on the porch. Witnesses claimed they could hear his frantic knocking from inside, but the storm was so fierce no one dared open the door. Since then, the manor has been abandoned, but many who visit report hearing knocking on the doors or seeing Edward's ghost, forever reliving his final moments. Some say the frost that forms on the windows, even in mild winters, is a sign of his restless spirit. I've never been back to Winter Manor, and I never will. The image of Edward at the top of those stairs, pounding on that invisible door, still haunts me. They say some places carry the weight of their tragedies, and Winter Manor is one of them. The cold of that house wasn't just from the snow. It was something deeper, something that will never thaw. And there you have it, the top 10 creepiest winter ghost stories to give you chills. From ghostly brides and frozen apparitions to haunted cabins and spectral trains, these tales remind us that winter's chill isn't always from the snow. Which story sent shivers down your spine? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share for more bone-chilling stories. Until next time, stay warm and stay safe.